Hi, I'm here with one final lecture on this subject of the relationship between science and religion. With this lecture, I hope to, in some way, draw together all of these different threads and these different strands of thought, and try to win through to some kind of comprehensive vision of this theme. Once again, I'm reminded of this parable of the blind man and the elephant, and we encounter the elephant in many different and diverse aspects, but we then try to, in some way, synthesize this diversity in our understanding to reveal to ourselves the underlying unity. And so I hope these lectures, this series of lectures, will have served that purpose. In the first lecture, I sort of outlined an entry point into the question, the idea of science and religion, and this entry point was by way of thinking of it in terms of the distinction that we can make between fact and value, or is and ought, and I called this Hume's fork. And so this was a possibility to conceptualize science as trying to address itself to the topic of fact, the topic of what is. Religion, by contrast, orienting itself more towards the topic of how things ought to be, a sort of ideal, a model to follow, a way to live, actually. And this is really the fundamental distinction. There's nothing in science and the scientific method that prepares it to give us any kind of advice of really how to live in the world. That's something I hope to unfold in this lecture, and I hope that I've established a basis to unfold it, a kind of a groundwork in the lecture immediately prior to this, in which I attempted to outline something of the kind of the genesis of science, the birth of science, kind of out of the side of philosophy, so to speak. And I tried to give a vision of a kind of ancient, comprehensive sense of life that included the sort of seeds, or the in potentia included all of the diverse, the 1,000 different disciplines that we encounter today. Science representing, a number of those. And so in this lecture, again, I hope to carry forward some of the thoughts that have already been introduced, and also to deepen them, but and then foremost to bring them into a sort of comprehensive unity. And so in order to do that, one way I'll again kind of set out a distinction between science and religion before finally trying to bring them back together and actually show not exactly how they're the same, but more how they compare rather than how they contrast. But to begin with, another perhaps helpful way of distinguishing between, again, science and religion. We've already laid out ways of thinking of is versus ought. Again, this is called Hume's fork. Fact versus value, quantity versus quality. And one perhaps helpful kind of schematic that can also serve us in this attempting to make this conceptual distinction in our minds is to think of the difference between means and ends, and to really understand the way in which science orients itself towards means. It puts itself, better way to say that maybe, is puts itself in the service of means. Science itself concerns a question of basically, performing the scientific method. So, proposing a hypothesis and then basically attempting to falsify it by way of observation. But nothing about this, nothing about this by itself can, the scientific method by itself, it depends on something outside of it, basically to continue. What I mean by that is there's nothing from within science that can tell us what's worth studying, or what kind of hypothesis we should formulate, where we should, what is of value really. Again, I suggested that's something that religion has oriented itself towards, is questions of value, questions of how to act, how to live in the world. I proposed in the first lecture how the kind of problematic truce between science and religion, because science is ostensibly telling us how to, what kind of place the world is. And that question itself is fundamentally intertwined with how we should live in the world. We can't really answer a question of how to live unless we know what kind of place the world is. And science seems to be, it professes to serve that role of teaching us about the world. The trouble is, as I outlined in the second lecture, part of the scientific method has actually been effacing all of those elements of the world that actually pertain to matters of quality, matters of value, matters of representing one thing as more significant or more important than something else. Science again can deal with quantity and with size certainly, but quantity and size are not the same thing as significance. In fact, if there's any relationship, it's tenuous at best. And so this puts us in a difficult position. And what ends up happening is science often, in some ways, kind of by necessity, it appeals to or even imports elements that could only really, if they were revealed, you could only really conclude that they are religious elements. That might be, somewhat of a bold statement, but I think I can defend it by just suggesting that, first of all, whether we call something a religion or not doesn't by itself establish that it is a religion or that it's not a religion. Merely because we refuse to call something a religion doesn't preclude the fact that it could be one. I'm reminded of a famous anecdote from and maybe it's apocryphal, but about Abraham Lincoln, Honest Abe, who was a prosecutor in Kentucky before his involvement in politics, and he was there was a witness on the stand, and Abraham Lincoln was the prosecutor, and he came and to cross-examine the witness, and just to sort of establish a baseline or a control, he posed the question to the witness. Mr. Jones, how many legs, Mr. Jones, does a horse have? And Mr. Jones was trying to be extra careful. He's under oath on the witness stand, and he says, 4 legs. And Lincoln then presses him a little bit further and says, now, supposing, Mr. Jones, supposing that I call the tail of a horse, supposing that I call the tail of the horse a leg, how many legs does a horse have then? Once again, Mr. Jones, trying to be extra careful, he says slowly. He says, does the arithmetic, says 5 legs, and Lincoln, Honest Abe, his response is, sorry, Mr. Jones, calling a leg don't make it a leg. And so we can say the same thing about religion. Calling something religion or calling it something other than religion. That by itself doesn't really establish one way or the other. The question is, we have to try to grasp what is the essence of the thing that's being proposed, and anything that has to do fundamentally with moral precepts or prescriptions or proscriptions of action. Establishing principles by which to live. One thing we can say by process of elimination is this is certainly not scientific. There's just no basis in the scientific method because, again, part of the scientific method itself is omitting or effacing all of those elements from our study of the world. Really, the ideal of science is to achieve a vision of how the world would look if human beings were not in it, really. And certainly the first-person perspective, we're not in it. It's trying to achieve a vision of the world without perspective, without experience, without first-person experience. In some ways, you could think of it as third-person experience, but it's really that's not quite accurate either. It's really attempting to achieve a view from nowhere in some ways, a vision of the world without any standpoint from which it's being perceived. This naturally, together with the first-person perspective, it also rejects any kind of value or moral precepts. So certainly, science is just not the right place to appeal for questions of how to live. And evidently, religion, by contrast, in many ways, that's one of its foremost purposes, is precisely to, in some way, one way to think about religion is that it attempts to sort of almost to encode, whether it's in theory, like a theology, whether it's in theory, in myth, like through stories and symbols, and then certainly in practice, like through rituals and traditions. So religion attempts to encode through theory, through myth, and through practice, attempts to encode really structures of how to live. And these are always, it attempts to in some ways educate the heart and the mind, so that educating the passions is one way to think about it. Passions being the elements of affect, so pleasure and aversion and so on, all of the different shades of feeling and emotion. Trying to educate them in a way that orders them towards what is good, and always. Whenever we perform some action, like this goes back to Plato and Aristotle, nobody does something that they think is bad. Always the kind of engine or the motive force or the inspiration for any one of our acts of will is always because we think that's good. We think that is somehow going to profit us or going to benefit us, going to serve what we think is good. It's a contradiction in terms to think we're faced with certain possibilities of decision, and to choose the one we think is worse. That it's almost, again, it's like saying that a square has three sides or something like that. It's almost a logical contradiction. The will always orders itself to what we think is good and the best of our knowledge. And Plato and Aristotle, they point out that we can be deceived or deluded about this. We can be under, like Plato's cave illustrates, we can be under a sort of illusion, and that just means that we still perform what seems to be good. It's just that what seems to be good is not always what is good. And religion, in some ways, is meant to kind of serve as a structure to help orient and educate the soul towards what's truly good, rather than what merely seems to be good. And this is, of course, something that it's the end of a process and not the beginning of it. But the point is, religion provides certain structures that can help orient people in that way. Now, the trouble is, well, I don't know if it's. I guess it's a trouble. It's because whenever when in some way it's not negotiable. Like it's necessary actually to have some kind of structures and some way of conceptualizing the kind of proximate good, and then and really the proximate good is always the only way to establish what is kind of proximately good is by reference to a standard of what is ultimately good. The kind of the summum bonum, Plato's the good, Aquinas's and the Catholic and Christian God, right? The good, God, the summum bonum, whatever the Dharma, right? The Tao, whatever is ultimately good. This is always, in some way, proximal goods are always judged in respect to that supreme standard. And again, religion fundamentally orients itself towards questions of really how to live. And again, just you can't emphasize enough, really, science doesn't do that. And the trouble is, people, especially with the success of science, people have been tempted to try to derive this ideas of how to live from science. And I won't belabor the drawbacks and actually the dangers of that, but I do want to bring attention to it and emphasize it, and just point out that in principle it's really a mistake. And so one way of thinking about then the distinction between science and religion is to think that science basically facilitates achieving ends. So it actually I'm reminded in direct connection to a prior lecture, specifically the lecture on technology and Promethean fire, archetypal fire. Science can really be seen in this respect as a kind of Promethean enterprise, Faustian enterprise even, and arguably like a sorcerer's apprentice, enterprise, in the sense that often, as we can see, many of the world's problems to which we look to science for solutions are actually created by science, and the same token. It's not exactly science creating them. It's that science basically, again, it kind of augments or increases in magnitude any one of our capacities to achieve whatever ends that we determine that we're going to strive for. And this is for better or for worse, because obviously whether science is put towards a good end or not is determined by specifically what that end is. And again, that's what religion, at its in its proper function, can help us to discern. So again, science really concerns means. Religion then concerns and orients itself towards ends. And so again, you can picture a sort of horizontal dimension, the idea of again science science augmenting a person's reach. Again, like technology, if I have a certain arm span, then of course that arm span is augmented if I can send first of all, if I have a stick, and then of course if I can send a robot or something to do my bidding. And this is just a picture, a vignette of what science is everywhere accomplishing, which is if human beings set out to achieve something and they have science, the knowledge of science, then they can, technology is kind of like the arm of science, and so people can immediately achieve their ends with much greater efficiency. This is, of course, there's a sort of danger about this, because once again, provided the ends are good, then there's no danger. But it's not a foregone conclusion that the ends will be good. And moreover, just the notion of efficiency itself, and this is a real risk that I also brought up in respect to technology, several lectures prior to this. Science can actually, its expression in technology. It can actually, it's continually enhancing our efficiency, and it can actually begin to, like I suggested in this lecture on technology, we're always working upon the world, but the world's always working back upon us too. And specifically with science and this kind of this ability to increase our efficiency will tend to have the effect of actually conditioning our very interface and very perception of the world. It will tend to have the effect of conditioning our very perception of the world towards just seeing everything as means to be means, and efficiency then can become a kind of de facto end in itself, without any sort of higher order good to appeal to. We will be tempted to merely seek efficiency for efficiency's sake. Once again, obviously this is in itself neither bad nor good, but once again, if it's sort of a leap of faith, I guess, to just presume that whatever people happen to wish to accomplish is actually good and doesn't just seem good, especially if we're not really willing to think about it and to pose difficult questions and to think about them critically. Science is often equated with critical thinking, and that's partly true, but in other ways it couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, in some way, science it sort of it presupposes all of its function, rather than reflecting critically on again. What is of value, what is worth, not just how to achieve something, but what is worth achieving in the first place. What is of value to achieve in the first place? This is not meant to be a criticism of science at all. In fact, science has proven it would be kind of absurd to criticize science in the sense that science has proven to be consummately effective in what it's in its specific scope, in its specific domain. If anything, my criticism is levied towards something that masquerades as science, but actually extends beyond the specific scope and compass that the scientific method itself delineates. This is once again to just repeat the point. This is whenever science directly begins to influence and dictate specific policy, whether it's political or just how to live. The best that science can say is, hypothetically, if this, then this. It doesn't say, it never gives anything categorically like you ought to do this, a person ought to do this. And so again, science can, just to kind of schematically conceptualize it, science concerns itself with means, and you can think of this as a horizontal dimension. Means or methods refers to basically, in some sense, in space and time, shortening the gap between the initiation of some process and its consummation. So, to use an example from an earlier lecture, if you have to fly to, if you have to travel to New York, obviously, if you have to go by foot, there's a certain distance that New York is from Alaska, and if you can go by some technologically mediated means other than just your feet, then in some ways, this distance actually shortens. The distance is smaller if you think of it in space and time. The time takes less, or it takes less time to arrive at your destination. And this is again a kind of image for what science is doing everywhere by increasing efficiency. So whenever there's a beginning and then an outcome, the distance between those two things is shortened because we can appeal to science and technology. Religion, again, though, if science is conceived as this kind of horizontal dimension, religion then can be conceived as a vertical dimension, representing, again, basically like a hierarchy of good, always ordered towards some kind of absolute or transcendent good that becomes the standard by which we can measure any subordinate or proximate good. And so I hope that's helpful, as another sort of tool to help us conceptualize the difference between science and religion. Now I would like to start to again kind of transition into a way of thinking about how to not only differentiate science and religion, but also integrate them. And one way of thinking about that is starting with science. I've alluded to this, but I just want to emphasize it and make it very explicit. Science only is as a sort of a condition, like a transcendental condition for science, for us even to be able to consider science. And I would suggest, in fact, that there is a kind of evolutionary, a reason that's embedded in the evolution of consciousness, of human consciousness. There's a reason that science was only appeared at a certain point in that evolutionary trajectory of human consciousness, because of this condition for science, which is that it's necessary to be able to imagine the world in a way that's in a certain way that's totally different from the way that we experience it. I suggested in outline in the last lecture the way that again science is attempting to achieve a concept of the world without anybody perceiving it. So and that might not seem, if that doesn't strike the listener as extremely, like really extraordinary, that's probably because I didn't do a good job explaining it, because it's extremely extraordinary. The idea that we in our life we're not actually familiar with anything. We don't encounter anything in our experience that is not an object of our, that everything we encounter it through a certain perspective, and a first-person perspective. And again, science is attempting to actually, reimagine a world, kind of somewhat conjectural and somewhat hypothetical, trying to extrapolate from first-person experience, which is the only experience any one of us has, but it's trying to extrapolate from information we can gain within first-person experience. It tries to extrapolate to how the world would be if first-person experience didn't exist. And so science, and so this is an immense accomplishment, an immense achievement of abstract thought, abstraction. And you see pictures of this everywhere, whether it's Einstein imagining, riding a beam of light, or whether it's, Copernicus picturing in some ways picturing himself on the sun rather than being on the Earth, and watching the Earth spin around him rather than what is manifest to all of us, which is that the sun rises and sets every day. These are all examples of, again, picturing the world in a way that we never experience it. The examples of Einstein and Copernicus, you would have to take those much further and really say what we're looking for is, for instance, Copernicus, the idea of the sun being at the center of the universe has long since been superseded, specifically, in fact, by Einstein, among other people. What we're really looking at is no center. We're looking at, fundamentally a kind of relative space that actually, the space itself curves and bends and stretches and warps, in accordance with massive bodies. And so this is really a vision that nobody could feasibly have except in imagination or in abstraction. And so science is only possible because of that ability. And I think it's just to emphasize, I think there's a, just like in human life, you have to achieve a certain level of intellectual maturity to be able to even entertain scientific notions in the first place. In the same way, I think humanity has to come of a certain age before it really even makes sense to think scientifically. And this is, I'm far from saying that there's something that somehow adult consciousness is superior to childhood consciousness. I don't think that's true at all. I think there's at the same time, I think there's significant differences. One way to say it is you give something up for the sake of gaining something else. I think it's clear to everyone who reflects on childhood that adult consciousness is, again, better in some ways, worse in other ways. In the same way, I don't mean at all to diminish ancient or traditional or primitive people by any means. I mean that was all of us one day. But rather just to point out that I think there's fundamental differences in the basically just their state of consciousness. Science is a product of a specific state of consciousness. I suggested in the first lecture it's a specific state of consciousness in which it's a polarized state of consciousness in which there's an extreme polarization between self and world. And in the last lecture, I showed a diagram that I was attempting to illustrate that with. I can actually show the diagram again briefly. This is in some ways meant to illustrate that polarization. And so you imagine the world as a periphery, and the self, the SELF, as again as a sort of central point. And this is the idea of perspective. And we're always looking from the perspective of first person. Science, again, though, is attempting to actually conceptualize the world not from the center at all, but from the periphery. Having established that science, again, depends on this ability to actually imagine the world very differently from how we will ever even conceivably perceive it. I think in some ways religion depends on a similar capacity, but in a very different way. Religion basically depends on the ability to imagine a world differently, imagine the world to be different than it is, but not so much in a kind of abstraction or an extrapolation, but rather in a sense of an ideal. And so just the ability to conceptualize higher goods and ideals towards which a person wishes to strive. This itself is also an accomplishment that it's difficult to imagine. it requires a certain stage of development has to be attained before this is even feasible, to be able to entertain ideals and resolutions and follow through towards them. And religion is presenting people with kind of, again, these models, or models to emulate, ideals to strive for. And so in some ways, religion and science, they share that that demand, or that necessary transcendental condition of being able to, imagination, really, for lack of a better word, provided that we don't entertain the connotation of, like, just because something is imagined that it's false. I mean, this was also the topic of another lecture, the lecture on Plato's Meno dialogue. But really, memory and imagination, everything that we can't see, well, so put another way, everything that we see is kind of grounded in and contained by and supported by everything that we can't see and that we actually just imagine. And I can't see what's behind my head in some way, but it's continually informing my perception of what's in front of it. And so, another way to think of science and religion, again, more in a sense of trying to establish their integration, really, is just to think of the way in which no other creature that we know of could actually. So not only is it necessary for human beings and humanity to achieve a certain stage of development before science or religion makes sense, but the same thing could be said just in terms of the other beings that we encounter in the world, and starting with a stone, and then a crocus, or and then like a fox maybe, or a lion, and then a human being. I think there's just a self-evident difference, and not just a random or arbitrary difference. It's a hierarchical difference. And obviously it's not a hierarchical difference of like sharp teeth or anything, because then the lion would come out on top. And it's obviously not a hierarchical difference of photosynthesis or prettiness, because then the crocus might come out on top. Or a hierarchical difference of stoicism, because then the rock would come up on top. No, it's a hierarchical difference of I'm grasping for the right expression for this. It has something to do with consciousness, but it's a hierarchy. It's a hierarchical difference of being able to with the understanding to actually encompass, or interpenetrate, or recreate, or imagine, or participate, is probably the best word, actually. To be able to participate with your mind, with your consciousness, in the entirety of the universe. To have a concept of, quote, the world. It's a deceptively simple statement, but I think it's quite profound to really reflect on it. The fact that as human beings we can actually entertain a concept of the world, or the cosmos, or the universe, or quote, reality, quote, being, quote, the universe, the cosmos, the world, the earth, the galaxy, the universe. The fact that we can actually entertain a concept like this, and that it's meaningful, like we can fill it with content, this is really extraordinary and profound. And both science and religion, they emerge as a following that ability as a necessary condition. And so really, if we really to really think the concept of the world, this is in some way, the mind, or the consciousness, has participated, expanded in some way, not in a spatial way so much, but in a conceptual way, expanded, to reach the ends of the world, the boundaries of the world, and it's extraordinary, really. Obviously, we don't have perfect resolution, and perfect detail, but arguably detail would serve to confound rather than augment any vision of reality. This is again something that I suggested this is kind of going back to the difference between science and religion, but it's really the religious impulse that grounds our ability to triage and be able to recognize what is of greater value. Whenever we're telling a story, we always have to select certain elements and at the expense of others, and we end up discarding almost everything else. And in this way, science kind of draws on the same wellspring of religion in order to tell feasible stories about anything, whether it's the origin of species or the birth of the universe and so on. This is really, it's telling a story in a religious way, fundamentally in a non-scientific way, but I think it's unavoidable. The reason it's non-scientific is because, science, the ideal is actually to describe how the universe would look, or how reality appears, how the universe appears, if no one were there perceiving it, really, if there's no first-person consciousness. And so, any account of the Big Bang, for instance, or the evolution of species, this is extremely, in some ways, extremely fantastical, because it's imagining that some being with human-like perceptual apparatuses and all of these that provide for all of the secondary qualities, like I described in the last lecture, everything that's not quantifiable, but that fills our perception with life. It's imagining that hypothetically that somehow there's a being that's humanoid in this sense, in its perceptual capacities for secondary qualities, that somehow existed at a time before any of those sense organs and certainly human beings themselves had evolved or had existed. So it's extremely counterfactual, obviously, but it's meant to provide something by way of entry point into understanding the conceptual elements of these theories. But so once again, this I think it's worth emphasizing, though, that both religion and science they draw from this incredible ability for that we are possessed of, and you could call it mind or consciousness or logos or reason, but again, it's an intellect. It's the ability to conceptualize being or reality as such. That's amazing. And both science and religion are, in that way, they're just extraordinary and astonishing achievements of human beings, and they're similar in that way, in that they both depend on this kind of participation or interpenetration, this ability of the mind and the spirit and the consciousness to kind of identify with all of the world. And really, to think about it, a lion does not exactly have a world in the same way that human beings do. Certainly, a lion has a haunt and a hunting ground, obviously, and a watering hole and so on. But that's not the same thing as a world at all. Those are just kind of behavior potentials or affordances, to use a psychological term. And that's totally different from being able to, like I suggested, both science and religion, the ability to not only conceptualize the world, but it also conceptualize, imagine, like, kind of counterfactual variations on that theme of reality. It's really extraordinary. It's amazing. And so if a lion doesn't have that capacity to, again, kind of, it's like giving rise to another way of thinking about it. It's either participating with your mind or your understanding or your consciousness in the totality of existence is one way to think of it. Another way to think of it is kind of recreating the entire world within your consciousness. These are just two different ways of conceptualizing what happens in the mind. And the lion, as impressive a creature as the lion is, that's so far from any capacity that the lion has. Certainly, and other creatures as well, and certainly a tulip or a chrysanthemum or a geranium or whatever. Very pretty, but just not the same thing. In some way, they're to be able to reflect on the world as such demands this kind of, like the diagram was meant to suggest, not exactly a detachment from the world, but a kind of withdraw, a polarization away from the world into a self, to then be able to, with that self, take in the world again, kind of a second time. these are all sort of figurative ways of trying to express something, and I hope they serve to point to what they're meant to express. They're not meant to be taken as categorical statements or anything. Certainly, they're meant to serve as kind of, again, indications or pointers to something, pointers to an ability that we all are possessed of, certainly in potential, if not actually exercising it. And so I hope by now that this we're beginning to achieve a greater resolution and clarity as to both both the differences, the contrasts, and also the comparisons and the similarities between science and religion. And ultimately, the ideal is that we achieve a grasp of how they their proper roles and the proper place they can have in a integral human life. And this is maybe a place to actually introduce what philosophy might have to offer. So whereas science is in some ways attempting to achieve a grasp of the world, and eliminate every mistake that can come from one or another perspective on that world, and try to eliminate all perspective. So you again have a view from nowhere with nobody looking. Religion, by contrast, is always serving to it's meant to structure our lives and order our actions towards the good. From the religious perspective, it would be a mistake. Any mistake in a religious perspective is from kind of lack of perspective. It's like omission of this lived experience. The lived experience is essential to the religious element of life. It's seen as something to be exorcised or omitted or effaced from the scientific perspective. The lived experience, it's seen as a kind of confounding factor, a variable that's meant to be eliminated. William James famously wrote in one of these famous works, this not anthropological exactly, but philosophical, psychological works called The Varieties of Religious Experience. William James is an American philosopher from the 19th century. He famously defined religion as, he writes, "Were one asked to characterize the life of religion in the broadest and most general terms possible," says William James, "one might say that it consists of the belief that there is an unseen order, and our supreme good lies in harmoniously adjusting ourselves thereto." Now, as I suggested, this unseen order, this is actually something that both religion and science share. What differentiates religion from science is that religion actually offers a kind of injunction and says, like, there's actually something good, and that good thing consists in harmoniously adjusting ourselves to this order. Now, the reason I think this is worth just bringing up is because, I don't want to say for better or for ill, but it's just a fact that part of this order today is science. And so, in order to come to achieve this harmonious adjustment to the order of the world and life, this means in some ways integrating religion and science, and that's, I guess, I hope these lectures have been in service of that, and both religion and science, they sort of serve as not so much as they serve as ways of seeing. They as paradigms in the Kuhnian sense, they're not something so much that we see as something that we see through. We see the world through a scientific view or through a religious view, and the trouble is, as we know, they're so often in some way at odds with one another. And so, like I suggested, I think this might be a good place to bring philosophy into the conversation. And in some way, philosophy, one way of seeing philosophy is something that sort of straddles or attempts to integrate, or kind of has one foot in both worlds, the religious world and the scientific world. And we see, in some way, certainly for Plato and for Aristotle, and up until, again, like I suggested in the last lecture, up until the time of Francis Bacon and the Scientific Revolution, philosophy was seen as certainly not unscientific and also not unreligious. In other words, for Plato, philosophy was not just like an academic discipline. Certainly, it was a way of life. It was a way of life, in that way, it's a religious practice. It's also not contrary to science in the sense that, like I suggested in the last lecture, science very much emerged from the side of philosophy, so to speak. Or another way of saying it is, philosophy gave birth to science in some way. And then, to quote some ancient gossip called Diogenes, a historian called Diogenes, he actually presented an anecdote of Aristotle and said that people called Aristotle the foal, the polos in Greek, the foal, because it's the foal that kicks its mother after it's born, and the idea that Aristotle rejected some of the doctrines of his teacher Plato. In some way, you can see science as this kind of a little bit, not insolent exactly, but this wish to sort of establish its independence and identity by kind of in a reactionary sense against the tradition of philosophy and certainly against religion in some way. And once again, this is I'm speaking in figurative terms and sort of facetious terms, but there's something to it certainly. Part of the impulse of science, the impulse of has been an impulse of differentiating itself from tradition, certainly. And so again, Plato literally describes philosophy. He says, in the Republic, he says, this is not a small thing. This is no small thing, but it's how to live. When he's describing the dialectic and philosophy. And so I really think philosophy falls squarely between, in a way of serves as a kind of bridge again, or an integrating factor between science and religion. And it's really, it's been a philosophical enterprise throughout this lecture series, really. Not exactly a religious one, certainly, and not exactly a scientific one either. It's been foremost a philosophical enterprise that actually has this to offer, which is to reflect on both science and religion in independence, and then also in respect to one another, and in synergy, and to really try to establish the proper integration between these two things. Through the Middle Ages, when Latin was kind of the lingua franca, scientia was again the term that Francis Bacon appropriated to refer to natural science. This was often contrasted with sapientia, and we discover the word sapientia in actually the Latin name for the human being, which is of course Homo sapiens. Sapientia refers, if it were necessary to translate into English, whereas scientia would be translated as science, sapientia would often be translated as wisdom. And in fact, I noted this in a prior lecture that Augustine and other Latins, when they're translating the Greek word philosophy or the Greek word philosopher, they often translate it as amator sapientiae, in other words, the lover of wisdom. And so this is a distinction that's worth making, is that science directs itself and orders itself towards certain concerns. But wisdom directs itself towards different concerns, and it's actually the task of wisdom, the task of philosophy, to ensure that science science achieves a proper place among this pantheon of human gods, maybe is a way to think about it. And so just to kind of try to draw this into some sort of comprehensive synthesis, one way of thinking about science, religion, and philosophy is to think of just trying to appeal now to the very beginning, the outset of this series of lectures, and connect that now to this ending of it, the conclusion of it. I correlated, of course, science with fact, that was in the first lecture. And in this lecture, I related science to means, the method or the means. And and then I think it goes another, like I suggested, translation of sapientia into English would be wisdom. Translation of scientia is science, of course, but also knowledge. If you literally, the Latin word scientia refers to knowledge. And so you have science as fact-based, related to fact, related to means, and seeking knowledge. You have religion as value-based, like I suggested in the very first lecture at the outset of this series. You have it related to, not to means, but rather to ends. And you have religion is related to goodness, to moral goodness, to beauty, to again a kind of spiritual goodness, to the good, to God, to the Dharma, to the Tao, to again the summum bonum, the ultimate good, and then this ultimate good itself kind of gives dimension and establishes the structure. Structures all of the secondary goods, under this primary good. And so this characterizes religion. So you have science and religion, you have fact and value, you have means and ends, you have knowledge and goodness. And philosophy then is kind of orienting itself towards neither one of these things exactly, but towards truth in a way, towards wisdom, towards vision. And philosophy, again, I suggested, I think when it's serving its proper function, it's serving in a kind of serving to actually help all of the other elements, all of the other presences in this pantheon of the human being to find their proper roles. And this might be familiar to some as Plato's concept of Plato's vision of justice from the Republic. And justice, the idea that of every element of something serving its proper function, every organ serving its proper function, in a kind of a cosmos rather than chaos. Chaos is when everything, nothing serves its proper function, and cosmos is a kind of an order or harmony, an internal harmony. And so I hope that with this series of lectures that at least we've been successful in achieving some kind of vision and some kind of approach towards that. So I think at that point this is where I will draw this series of lectures to a close. This is probably the last lecture, but I just want to express my gratefulness and just to everyone who's been along for this journey, and then just kind of send my best wishes and my farewell to all of you, and happy trails, and I look forward to the next circumstances that bring us into connection again. But until then, farewell from me, and till next time.